Hello, and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. Today is Friday, July 26th. I'm Mary Ann Azevedo, and joining me is TC senior reporter on the Venture Beat and co-host of our sister show, Found, Becca Skutak. How are you, Becca?
I am doing well. How are you, Mary Ann?
I'm tired. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, me too.
I'm tired. Yeah, we're doing some renovations on our home. And while it's exciting, it's just also a lot going on, but I shouldn't complain. But anyway, we have so much to talk about today. It feels like a lot happened this week, and it just feels like 2 weeks rolled into one for some reason. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, not even like tech news either, just like news across the board from politics, other areas of business, tech. It just seems like this has been like kind of a crazy week.
Yeah.
Out of nowhere. It's the middle of July.
Right, exactly. Well, anyway, I'm excited to talk about what we've got on the show today. And our deals of the week include Clio, Waymo, Aviato. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
I think so.
Yeah. And then we're going to look into who's saying no to M&A. And lastly, the risk of working with a fintech. So first up, I covered Clio's massive raise. It was a $900 million Series F round. That's a lot of money these days. I mean, it's a lot of money anytime, but especially these days. And their new valuation, which is $3 billion. So Clio is it's not a startup in the sense that it's, just a few years old or anything. It's actually been around for about 16 years. It's a Canadian company, and basically they just aim to help law practices run more efficiently with its cloud-based technology. I've been covering Clio for a few years, so I'm pretty familiar with the company. I like the CEO. He's very articulate, a great interview, just straightforward, which is refreshing. And, they're growing a lot, and it's impressive because you don't typically see this kind of growth at such a late stage in the company. For example, their revenue, ARR, they just crossed ARR this year of $200 million. That's up from $100 million 2 years ago. So, they're obviously doing something right. And they attribute a lot of that growth to two things. One, fintech. They've added embedded payments into their offering. And two, of course, a doubling down on AI. So, also, another interesting thing about this deal I don't want to forget to point out, NEA, a new backer, led the raise with an investment of over $500 million. Something that you might find interesting, Becca, since you're so knowledgeable about the secondary market, is that a good portion of this funding is secondary financing. It's not all just primary capital. So they wanted to give some liquidity back to long-term investors and employees as well. So I'll be quiet for now. Sorry, I get excited sometimes. What did you think about this?
No, it's interesting that you say some of it is secondaries, which isn't surprising at all. I feel like we honestly, if we're not already, should be asking like any late stage company raising around how much of it is actually primary, especially because when you mention how old, saying how old the company is sounds bad, but the fact that the company is 16 years old means there are probably a lot of early stage investors who could take a really nice payout if they divested now. So that's not surprising, but I'm curious what you thought about you mentioned a little bit about how it's interesting to see them get this much traction, especially now that they have reached the later stages. I know we don't want to dive too much into rumors and speculation here, but there's been some interesting scuttlebutt on Twitter, and I've seen some on LinkedIn too, about how there's some people who are just like not sure about the legal tech space, especially a lot of the newer companies that have come in saying that they have these crazy AI solutions. And I know obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but usually companies don't make it to a $3 billion valuation or make it 16 years without traction. So obviously Clio is not who they're talking about, but I'm curious what you think about the fact that people are kind of skeptical of this category right now. Like, how do you think Clio has been able to sort of rise above that?
Well, there was another company in the space that raised a large round this week, actually. Harvey, which is backed by OpenAI, raised $100 million. I would say that Clio is different because they didn't start out saying, okay, we are an AI legal tech startup. I mean, it was the opposite. They've been doing software for the legal industry for well over a decade, for like 14, 15 years before they started to incorporate AI into their offering. So they really have built up their credibility and their reputation over the years, and they're profitable. They've been profitable for several years now. So they're not a company that's saying, hey, we're an AI startup that does legal tech. No, right. They're more a legal tech startup that is incorporating AI into their offering. So I feel like they're very different from, and I'm not saying that all these newer players are not credible or doing legitimate things. I'm not saying that at all, because to be honest with you, I don't really know a lot about these newer companies in the space. But I would just say that to me, that's where Clio is different.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense, especially because they've already got that trust. And so if they add on new features, their customers are going to trust them probably more so than a new player to begin with.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because Harvey raised $100 million. It's Series C round, actually. And it was led by GV, Google's corporate venture arm, and had some pretty other big names, Kleiner Perkins, Sequoia, that were participants, and valued that company at $1.5 billion. So that's a pretty high valuation for a fairly young company in this space. So I don't know a lot about Harvey or any of the other competitors, but am very impressed by Clio. One of the things that, of course, being a fintech nerd, that I thought was interesting is how they've incorporated payments. And I never thought about this, but they were saying that payments in the legal space can be nuanced and different than other industries. Because, for example, if you're dealing with trusts or trust funds, one of the things that you cannot do, for example, this is how it was explained to me. There are trust funds and trust transactions, and you can't take like fees for credit card transactions off the top of a trust account transaction.
Interesting.
Yeah, the same way you would, for example, like if a small merchant using a Square account. So like if a lawyer charges $100 for a trust transaction and $3 comes off in processing fees and only $97 is deposited in a bank account, then a lawyer would be essentially committing malpractice by not depositing 100% of the funds into the trust account. So Clio has worked to make its offering compliant with these sort of trust-related accounting needs and makes it, they say, easy for lawyers to use. So I think things like that, I mean, obviously it's doing something right in that capacity to have doubled its ARR in 2 years.
Definitely.
Yeah. So 2 big deals in the legal tech space. Anyway, speaking of investments and long-term potential, Rebecca Ballon wrote about Alphabet investing another $5 billion into Waymo this week. Becca, can you tell us more about that?
Yes. So during Alphabet's second quarter earnings call this Tuesday, the company CFO said that Alphabet is set to spend an additional $5 billion on Waymo in a multi-year investment. According to Alphabet's CFO, the funds will enable Waymo to continue to build the world's leading autonomous driving technology company. I think this is interesting. Well, one, it's a large amount of money, of course. $5 billion is nothing to snuff at. But from talking to Kirsten Korosek, our transportation editor over here at TechCrunch, who listeners you are very familiar with from the show, she said what was interesting about this round is, of course, while Alphabet investing more money means that they are, of course, at least somewhat positive, somewhat hopeful about this technology, want to invest more resources to see it through. It's interesting, some of the language they used. She mentioned how they said up to $5 billion. That means it sounds like this deal is somewhat conditional. And in the same vein, when Waymo has raised money in the past, it is raised from outside investors as well. And in this time, it is not. So definitely a couple interesting little threads to pull on there. But hey, $5 billion, I mean, even if there's conditions, even if there's clauses, $5 billion is not necessarily a negative sign of what Alphabet thinks Waymo is doing.
Yeah, that's a huge vote of confidence, a lot of money indeed. And apparently, according to Alphabet CEO, Waymo is today delivering well over 50,000 paid rides per week, which is a lot more than I would have thought. You know, they offer a fully driverless ride-hail service in San Francisco and Phoenix, and recently expanded to Los Angeles and Austin. I mean, I think that's even more than I realized. I didn't realize it was quite that many per week.
Yeah. No, that's a lot. Would you take a driverless taxi? No, me neither.
No.
Even though I'm horrified of driving, I still wouldn't do that.
Nope. That's one thing that Alex Wilhelm, former co-host of Equity, and I would very often argue, or, not argue, but debate about. And he was so pro autonomous vehicles. And hey, I mean, I'm not saying I'm against autonomous vehicles at all, but I do not want to be in one. I do not want to be driven around by a car that has no human driver. I'm sorry. I'm not comfortable with it. I don't know if I ever will be.
Yeah. No, I'm definitely not one of the people who's going to go out and like slash the tires of a self-driving car either. But on the whole spectrum of how excited I am about this technology, I will admit I am more on the tire slashing side than the I can't wait to do this side. But I'm only moderately past the center. No one worry about me. If you see headlines, it wasn't me.
No, that's hilarious. I could never imagine you doing anything like that, Becca. No, never. But I remember a couple of years ago at Disrupt, we were in San Francisco and a few of us were at dinner. And Kirsten, of course, who's our transportation editor, was like, oh, let's go hop in one of the driver, autonomous vehicles or whatever. And a couple of the other reporters, okay, yeah, let's go. And I just sat there. I was like, see ya, not joining you. We'll hear all about it later. Anyway, Kirsten couldn't be with us today, so this section was a little bit shorter than it might have been if we didn't have her wonderful expertise. But we will be talking about Alphabet again in a bit. For now, though, we can agree that not all compelling investments have to be in the multi-billion-dollar range. Becca, you wrote a fun story this week about Aviato. I love this, of course, considering that the founder is 17 years old, the same age as my son. So please tell us more.
Yeah. Aviato emerged from stealth this week and announced that it had raised $2.3 million. Aviato is essentially looking to make a Crunchbase or a PitchBook, so a database of sort of private market data, but adding a little bit more to it. So in addition to things like funding rounds, headcount, which you can kind of find across some of its other competitors, it also has things like employee vesting schedules, credit card revenue data, and is meant to kind of have this analytical piece on top of it to help investors make decisions. And it was started by Eric Zhu, who realized he wanted a better product like this when he was starting to invest himself, which all of this sounds all good and fun until you remember that he is 17 years old, which is crazy to me because at 17, I worked at a Panera Bread and I had never heard of venture capital. So Zhu told me that he had originally gotten interested in the space from Discord channels back during the pandemic. He happened to join, in his words, right place, right time, happened to join channels that included notable people from the Valley like Sam Altman. He just got really interested in the space and started to put a hand in himself. Maybe the most surprising part of this is that this is not his first startup. His first startup was acquired after 10 months. It was bringing schools and schedules and things like that online. I just think these kind of stories are just so fun because it's a great reminder that, of course, we are in the tech industry. We cover tech through and through, what the actual products are, what they look like, how they work. But all of this stuff is done by people. So it's always fun to be able to kind of highlight someone in the space doing something fun.
Yeah. Like I said, I love this story, I guess, partly because I do have a son this age and he is pretty tech savvy. But wow. Yeah. So Eric started this company called eSocial. I think is what you mentioned, a digital platform for schools in 2021. Got acquired 10 months later. And then he joined a VC firm.
Yes. Yeah. So he's an investor. He's a 2-time startup founder, and he is still working on that high school degree. But I just thought this story was so funny because he really built this whole company, Aviato, from the bathroom at his high school. He would lie to get out of class. He would set up a ring light and a background and take Zoom calls. He kept getting caught, and then he got kicked out of school. And now he's in the Valley and he's building. And for listeners, if you recognize the name Aviato, yes, it is that Aviato from HBO's Silicon Valley. Eric noticed that the IP for it was not protected, so he took it. Smart.
Wow, what a smart young man. I mean, yeah, I was fascinated by all this. So yeah, he was in India. Excuse me. I haven't had a coffee yet today. Can you tell? He was in Indiana when he was taking calls in the bathroom. So I was like trying to picture this in my head. How on earth did he fit a ring light and all of that in a stall?
I know. There are pictures of it. Like he has pictures on his website and stuff. But I know even from talking to Eric Bond, a general partner at Hustle Fund. Hustle Fund's not an investor, but Eric Bond personally is. And I talked to him about it. And he was like, oh, yeah, when you were on calls with him, like you hear the bathroom, which is just like, oh my God. Like I can't imagine hearing that kind of stuff when you're like on the phone doing like a work call. But I mean, hey, it worked out.
It did work out. Yeah. Eric said that Eric Bond said. He clearly looked quite young, but he was oddly mature. And that, yeah, he claimed that he had stomach problems. I'll just say that so that he could have 30 minutes to chat with the venture investor. Love this story. I'm so glad you wrote it. I remember seeing a post about it on X a couple of months back and thinking, this is so cool. And then, thankfully you picked it up and wrote about it so I could learn more and our readers could learn more. So awesome job on that, Becca. So anyway, we're going to be taking a break, but when we're back, we'll be talking about Wiz walking away from Google's $23 billion acquisition offer. So stick with us. Yeah, so the week started off with the crazy news that Wiz was walking away from that $23 billion acquisition offer from Google. This was definitely the talk of the startup world on Monday. And there was all sorts of notes about, did Wiz leak this? How did this just happen to all get out? Just a lot going on. But I mean, who walks away from a $23 billion acquisition offer? I mean, Wiz is a cybersecurity startup company. They were last valued at about $12 billion. The CEO apparently told the startup's 1,200 employees, who they call wizards, saying no to such humbling offers is tough, but with our exceptional team, I feel confident in making that choice, and that their next milestones are $1 billion in ARR and an IPO. So, Becca, what did you think? Did you expect this?
It's crazy to think of walking away from a $23 billion acquisition. And I know rumors of this deal originally started getting talked about last week. A lot of people were saying that, of course, this would be Alphabet's largest acquisition of all time. So it's crazy to even think it's a huge deal they're walking away from. And it's like a company like Alphabet, a company like Google, their biggest acquisition potential just like kind of being wiped off the table. But the thing that I keep coming back to is just how young the company is. The company's only 4 years old. So I know when it looked like the deal is still on, I wrote a piece that came out last weekend that was talking about how if the deal went through, like what it could mean for the startup ecosystem. And I spoke to some people, and one of the things that kept coming up is the fact that this would affect the industry more than, say, a different acquisition because of how young the company is. That not only affects the numbers, that makes the average age of a company at the exit actually shorter. It just does, because the number would get factored in. It changes the average. And it's a thing that investors could talk about when they were fundraising to show that if LPs backed them, they would get money back sooner than, say, 10, 12 years where the average company is currently sitting at exit time. So I'm curious how much that plays into this, because if the founders just started this in 2020, there's probably so many things they're imagining for this company that they just haven't done yet, because it's still, no matter, it grew super fast, it expanded, of course, but it's just so young.
Yeah, it is young. And it's not their first company, right? The 4 co-founders previously founded another company, also cybersecurity, called, and I'm probably pronouncing this wrong, Adalam, that Microsoft acquired for $320 million, which is so much less, right, than the value of this deal. So one of the things I would love to ask is, what made them say yes to Microsoft, but no to Alphabet?
Yeah, no, that's such a good point. And of course, people have also been talking about the antitrust aspect of this too. And I wonder if that plays a factor there, because people are worried any large deal now, just after what happened with Figma and Adobe, people are like scared of the antitrust stuff. And I know we've heard some stuff on our end, our colleague Ingrid, that they don't really think that was as much of an aspect here. But people were definitely talking about that. So I feel like if you're worried about that at all, people are a little more shy to jump the gun.
I mean, maybe it wasn't a huge factor in their decision, but I do think if the deal had gone through, there may have been antitrust concerns. Yes. So it's interesting. The company's backers include Index Ventures, Sequoia Capital, Thrive Capital, among others. Alphabet also was rumored to be acquiring HubSpot, right? Like a month or so ago, and then that didn't work out.
Yeah, another huge...
Apparently, Alphabet walked away from that, though, right? That was they walked away, not HubSpot, supposedly from... I mean, these are all rumors, of course, but...
Yeah, no, that's interesting, because obviously now if the Wiz deal's not going through, could be worth paying attention to some of these startups that are looking to be acquired. I know when I was reporting on this last week, I talked to an angel investor and a professor over at Columbia Business School, and she was like this isn't going to make all IPO candidates be like, well, time to get acquired. Like, it's not going to do that by any means. But I mean, even though Alphabet hasn't closed a deal, it has made it very clear that it is looking to buy, and it is looking to buy a large, substantial company. And I feel like that in itself is worth paying attention to as things go on from here.
I mean, in general, M&A hasn't been what I think everybody expected the past couple of years. I think we all thought, okay, dry IPO market, hardly anybody's going public these days. We're seeing, a lot less funding going to startups. So maybe we'll just see more and more companies just kind of merge or join forces or get acquired. But it really hasn't played out that way. I mean, we've seen some, but not in the way people thought it would. And we'll be talking more to Crunchbase's Janae Tier next week about M&A activity in the second quarter compared to, say, last year. But yeah, I mean, in general, I think it's not nearly what any of us thought it would be. Did you expect more M&A deals this year?
I did. And to clarify, not M&A deals like this. I definitely agree with the professor I spoke to that people were like, oh, well, if the IPO window is not opening back up, at least we'll see M&A. And I was like, yeah, but the M&A we're going to see is not going to produce the same liquidity that the IPOs you're hoping for would have. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, liquidity is liquidity. Early investors can make a killing on a even like $500,000 plus M&A transaction. So I did think we would see more this year, especially because there's certain things looking at the upcoming election where it would make sense to wait just to see either side has different opinions or different sort of plans for how things would play out. But Dan Primex talked about this in Prorata before, and I've seen other people echo this as well. M&A really isn't one of them. M&A is not generally as affected by an election year as IPOs and some other things are. And Dan Primex made the argument before that it doesn't look like the administrations would be very different on M&A, regardless of who is elected. And I know, of course, that was said before Joe Biden dropped out of the race, but we don't really have much evidence to think it's going to be crazy different from Kamala Harris either. So I definitely thought we would see more M&A. Maybe people are shy because of the election, but yeah, it's just not happening in the way we thought it would.
One thing I do wonder about, though, is if it is happening behind the scenes and we're just not really hearing about it as much. Maybe there's a lot of acqui-hires, or things like that. I mean, not everybody is very eager to announce things like that because they're afraid that it's a negative signal about their business. So my suspicion is that there might be more M&A activity than we even realize, but it's just not necessarily getting announced. But
yeah, I was just going to add to that. You're totally right. And something I always tell investors when they just ask like, oh, how can I be helpful or whatever to your reporting, is I've always said, you guys hear about deals, you guys hear about news as it's happening. We hear about it when companies decide to announce. So you're totally right that there could be more M&A than we know of this year. And people are just waiting to announce till a better market time or waiting to announce for a specific reason. I know you've probably experienced this too, where you cover around and you're like, oh, this was closed like a month ago. And they're like, no, it was closed 9 months ago. And you're like, oh, okay, like still notable, but that's interesting. Like the timeline, we always have to ask about that timeline because it's right. It can vary widely.
It can vary widely. I do remember, though, a couple of other instances that reminded me of this where startups walked away from large company acquisition offers, like Discord turned down an offer from Microsoft. I think, what was that, in 2021? Yeah. Said, that the talks were off. I think Discord wanted to stay independent. Clubhouse and Twitter didn't work out. So I feel like those two instances are kind of wildly different because Discord went on to still grow and be pretty popular and successful, whereas maybe Clubhouse should have taken up Twitter on that offer. Right?
Yeah, no, same with like Plaid and Visa. I'm sure Plaid is happy they didn't end up going through with that acquisition by Visa either.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. For sure. For sure. I think that was a blessing in disguise for Plaid. Right. Good point. Although that wasn't necessarily their decision.
Right.
But, it didn't work out. But hey, speaking of fintech, we also had some interesting news in the space this week. Digital banking startup Mercury made headlines for abruptly shuttering service for startups in countries like Ukraine and Nigeria. And this happened pretty suddenly, but I believe it was partly in response to some scrutiny, federal scrutiny that one of its partners had earlier this year around the practice of allowing foreign companies to open accounts. whatever the case may be, a lot of people were not happy about this move, right? I was kind of surprised by the number of social media posts on X and LinkedIn around it.
Yeah. And when I saw this was pretty surprising because like what's been happening in Ukraine specifically is nothing new, unfortunately. Of course, wish everything over there was going a lot better than it is. But it just seemed so out of the blue. Like I remember when we first saw this news drop, we were talking even among Slack where it's like, did the FDIC say something? Like they're changing their guidelines. Like it's kind of like, why is this coming now? And I feel like founders felt the same way where it's like, okay, well, if you've known this about my company the entire time, kind of like what changed? Also, I'm quickly trying to find the Mercury CEO posted something interesting about it yesterday.
Yeah. Well, in our story, a Mercury spokesperson claims that the company does continue to support founders with Ukrainian passports that are located in the U.S., but changed its policy to no longer support companies with founders located in Ukraine. They did initially say that it was bounding founders with Ukrainian passports and later revised that, calling it an error. So there was kind of a lot of weird back and forth out there that made it confusing. One founder said she wrote to the CEO asking for an explanation of the situation. She was worried that it was emblematic of a problem in the whole banking system where banks don't differentiate Ukraine from Russia. But apparently someone from Mercury, I think co-founder Jason Zhang, wrote her back and said he agreed that it was an unfair situation for founders in Ukraine. However, quote, it's an unfortunate reality that we can't support founders located in Ukraine right now. He went on to say that the company doesn't put Ukraine in the same category as Russia, but then in managing their compliance and risk and the U.S. sanctions against regions of Ukraine, there are commonalities in the controls and systems we have to put in place.
And looking at what Mercury's CEO, Imad Akhund, I believe I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, posted last night, he said similar, and he doubled down on a little bit that he said the countries that they're restricting in was less than 1% of Mercury's deposits. But because there were sanctions, and he talked about Ukraine particularly, 20%, he says, I quote, 20% of Ukraine is sanctioned. Verifying and monitoring which part of a country someone lives in to a high standard becomes highly complex at the scale, and the penalty for making even one mistake is large. So, end quote. So I think he's saying that they understand this is going to hurt people in good standing, but it requires so much compliance on their end to verify. And it seems like it's a small part of their business that they were kind of just like, I don't want to deal with this anymore, which is so unfortunate for the founders. Because again, did this change from 6 months ago? That's the real question.
Well, it could be that all that scrutiny, from the FDIC around the practices, that they were looking at with Choice Bank. Yeah. And also Tage, one of our reporters in Africa, said that a couple of Nigerian founders had the same issues this week. They had similar experiences, and Mercury told them that their accounts would be closed in the next 30 days, despite their startups being domiciled in the US. So it's really still kind of unclear if Mercury is using passports rather than local addresses in making these decisions. But it definitely caused an uproar. And another fintech decided, to step in, Brex, and said that they would try to offer to help Mercury customers in Ukraine. If you go to Brex's website, there's a post about them saying that account holders in Ukraine can get a 50,000 point sign-up bonus after depositing $500,000 into a Brex business account, and then an additional bonus after they spend $10,000 via their Brex card. So interesting to see that Brex doesn't seem to share the same concerns as Mercury. I don't fully understand why. But this does lead to something else. I mean, we've had a lot of discussion on equity in the past few months about Synapse and that banking as a service startups collapse and how that's impacted startups and consumers. And I think it makes people a little bit more hesitant to work with fintechs, to be honest with you. I mean, after what happened with Synapse, there's still millions of consumers with nearly 160 million in deposits. They cannot access their funds. So if you're a consumer, like I got emails from people saying, my daughter put $3,000 in this savings account at this fintech, and now we can't get our money back. Or, there's Juno, there's Yada. There's a lot of companies where people trusted them and put a lot of money, like 30,000 or even more, and they can't get access to their cash. I think it makes consumers as a whole a little hesitant. And in this case, maybe startups or other businesses are going to be hesitant to work with fintechs, considering that they got the rug pulled out from under them, or at least that's how they feel.
Yeah, no, I completely agree because while I obviously have a lot of hope for the fintech space as a whole, and so many companies are just doing great things, innovation that was very needed in the financial space, this is going to remind people that you are working with a company and not a financial institution, which I know, of course, they all say, and not by a financial institution, I mean like a bank that's regulated by the government. So it's like, of course, they say that stuff in the fine print, but I definitely have friends who are familiar with Chime who did not realize it was not held to the same standards as a bank. It's like people are definitely, I think, while these things won't turn people away from fintech entirely or turn, say, a founder who is starting a company, where do we want to put our bank account? I don't think this will turn everyone away from banking with someone like Mercury or using a fintech instead of a traditional bank, but it's going to remind people of that divide, that difference a lot more. And that doesn't work in the fintech industry's favor.
It doesn't. And I think a lot of consumers were naive and maybe, like you said, didn't read the fine print, didn't understand necessarily, this is not actually a bank. In the case of the startups, I think that they obviously probably were more informed and may have realized it. But still, this came out of nowhere. Mercury's had a lot of things going on. It was kind of tied in a little bit into the drama with Synapse. So a lot of upset founders, I'll say, and investors too. There was even a VC who posted on X saying Geek Ventures managing partner advised founders with Mercury accounts to open another account just in case. So this kind of reminded me a little bit of like last year with Silicon Valley Bank. It's not the same thing. Of course, Mercury is still around, but where like everyone's like, okay, you need a backup. Everybody needs a backup and just be careful. So anyway, this has been such a fun episode, Becca. I can't believe we have to go, but this
flew by.
I've had so much fun chatting with you. So, hey, but to our listeners, don't fear. We'll be back on Monday. Until then, you can find me on X at Bay Area Writer and Equity under the handle at Equity Pod on X and Threads. Becca, where can our listeners find you?
You can find me on X. It's going to be at my full name with an underscore in the middle. If you type in SZK, I usually will pop right up. You can also find me on TechCrunch's beautiful website. All of my work will be there, as well as the Found podcast, which if you like hearing stories about startups and the founders who built them, that is a great place to check out as well.
Hope everyone has a great weekend. Bye. Equity is produced by Teresa Loconsolo with editing by Kel. Bryce Durbin is our illustrator, and we'd like to give a big thanks to our audience development team and Henry Pickavett, who manages TechCrunch audio products. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.